Alright, let's talk through this FlashQuiz app, starting with index.html. One thing I'm going to highlight here is that we actually have two style sheets that are linked to this particular HTML file. We don't need to have it as two separate style sheets, but it happens to be that way in this case. The first one, FlashQuiz.css, handles most of the styling of the entire app, but we added this align.css to handle some of the vertical alignment issues, and we'll see some of those classes and IDs coming up in just a second. Okay, then we also have our FlashQuiz.js JavaScript file, which contains our functions as well as where we define the actual data, the terms and definitions for this app. Okay, so what we have essentially here is two separate divs on this page, one that links to the flashcard portion and the other that links to the quizzing portion. Now, just like in the Cowpoke app, where we defined a button that could be clicked on, and when it was clicked it called a function, we're doing a similar thing here with this div, where we click on this area of this div and it leads to a separate page. So we can actually have multiple HTML pages all in the same app, right? And they just reload on the screen. Now here we can also see that this is where some of this alignment stuff comes in, this outer container top and inner container and outer container bottom down below. That's what's allowing us to do some alignment that there's no real natural way to do in this file other than to use some CSS to do that. Okay, you'll notice that this index file doesn't actually call any functions. It just leads us to flashcard and to quiz. So let's go check those out. Let's start with flashcard. When we get to the flashcard page, we're going to see it still loads the same style sheets in JavaScript, but as soon as the body loads, it calls this function newCard. And as we can imagine, this is probably like pulling a new flashcard out of the deck, right? So it's going to create the flashcard. We'll look at that actual function in just a little bit. And then you can see here when we click, this is what this is telling us here, right? On the top div, right, which is supposed to be like the deck of cards with the terms on them. Anytime we click on that, it's going to give a new card. So it's going to bring up a new term. All right, and then down below in the lower div, we have this function showDef. So anytime that someone clicks on this lower div, it's going to show the definition of that term. So these are two functions that we're going to need to look at in the JavaScript file, newCard and showDef. Now we also have down below in the credits section, again, a link, right? So that if somebody clicks on this section, it's going to bring them back to the main page. We want to always, anytime we have multiple pages, we want to be aware of how are people going to navigate within this app, especially considering there's no back button within an app, unless we build one in. So now let's go take a quick look at FlashQuiz, which is going to look very similar right here, quiz.html. Again, it's very similar to flashcard.html, except now when the page loads, instead of new card, we see this function new question, right? Because it's a quiz. And the same thing is true if we click on the top div, it's going to load a new question. Then on the bottom, it's a little different. When we click on the bottom div, it's going to call this function showAnswer. But normally, when it just loads, it's displaying possible answers. Now, one way we have to handle this, right, is that we can't actually put the answers in the HTML file. It's going to depend on what randomly generated question has been put up there. So instead we use these IDs, answer A, answer B, answer C, and answer D. That way we can pull back later from the JavaScript and plug in possible answers, right, that have been randomized. So you'll notice this is a case where we have both a class and an ID. The reason for that is we might want to do some, what would I say, some like styling. Like we want all of these to be a certain font, we want them all to be a certain color, all the answers to be the same. Well, that's what the class is doing. By calling this a class, we're saying everything with this class is going to have the same formatting. But we want to be able to change separately the answer that goes into each one of these. And so that's what we're using the ID for. You'll notice that each of these four answers has a separate and unique ID. That's going to allow us to refer to that ID and put in a unique answer in each of these lines. If we were just to refer to the class and put an answer in there, it would give the same answer in all four lines because it's the same class. So it's handy, right? We can use both classes and IDs to do both our styling and referencing particular elements in the page. Again, at the bottom we have the credit section, which again links back to our main page. I don't think we need to spend too much time on the CSS in this case, on CSS files. They're pretty straightforward, mostly just centered around getting the font sizes and colors right. The align.css is worth taking a look at. This is again to do the vertical alignment in the main page, well, on each page actually. You won't really have to change anything here unless you want to change some of the colors, but this was necessary to make it all line up right. What I'd like to spend the rest of our time on is looking at this FlashQuiz.js JavaScript file. Now I've tried to make this a little more helpful for you by putting in some notes here about what each section does. Of course, that's good practice to get into when you're making your own JavaScript files. In this case, I hope it was helpful in kind of piecing out what each of these functions does. We start by defining just a couple variables at the top, and we have one particular kind of variable that's interesting, that's new for us in this particular app, which is an array. Right? And an array is essentially a list. And it can be a list of numbers and a list of words. It can even be a list of lists, right? So you can have these things nested together, which I know can get a little confusing. One of the first things we do, and I put it at the top just so that people can edit it easily, is you can create your list of terms and definitions, right? So this is done in the form of an array. Now you can see how we can refer to any piece of this list or of this array, right? The name of the array is def for definitions, and I can refer to the very first entry with these square brackets and 0. So the very first entry is actually 0. Right, and now notice that for this entry I'm actually giving it an array, an array with two elements in it, right? I have first this term, and then a comma, and then the definition associated with that term. Now this is important to point out that the first element of this array is in fact this whole thing, right? This list of two things. So if I want just the word cycle, right, out of this array, the way I could access that is I would have to type def, and this is the first entry, so I would do 0. And it's the first entry in the first entry, right? This cycle here. So I would do another square bracket and another 0. And so I can keep adding these square brackets, right, if I have a set of nested lists or nested arrays. So I can have this first entry, and the first entry of the first entry gives me the word cycle. Okay, so you'll see that throughout the rest of this these functions. Now if you want to change this, of course, you can just change the text and you can add as many entries as you want to this array. The rest of the app doesn't really care how many entries are there. It'll work with however many you put in there. Okay, now when we were doing the flashcard, we saw two particular functions were called. One was new card, and one was show def. So let's take a look at those two functions. Here's new card. You see that when this is called, and this is called again whenever you start the flashcard or anytime you click on the flashcard itself, the first thing it does is it checks the length of this def list, right? So you can make it as long as you want, and it's going to just measure the length with def.length. I need that in order to be able to choose a random number, right? I want a random number that's somewhere between 0 and the length of that list. This is going to allow me to pick a random entry from that list. So I have here rand, right, which is a variable I defined at the top. And that's going to be set again to, we've seen this before, the math.floor of math.random times number of defs. So remember that math.random is a random number between 0 and 1. And so it's going to be multiplied times the number of defs, that is the length of this list. So that's going to give me an integer, which is a number between 0 and the length of this list. So now what I can do is push this random term back to the flashcard. So you'll see here document.getElementById term, right, which is the top flashcard in this case. And I'm saying the HTML is going to be switched to this list, and I'm pulling my random integer for the first entry, which means I'm pulling randomly from 0 through 8 here, so any one of these terms could come up. And you'll notice that there's 0, which is to say I'm pulling the first entry, which is the term. So that's going to kick back just that term, so either just cycle or data or fair test, back to our flashcard. Now this last part is sort of unnecessary. It's just kicking back this generic text definition to the bottom card, right, so that you know that a definition is going to show up there. It doesn't need to do that necessarily every time. The reason it's been added, though, is that when you've watched one of the flashcards and you've revealed the definition, if you want to go back and erase the definition, that's what this essentially does, right? So that if someone examines one of the flashcards, reveals the definition, then they click on it for a new card, it erases the definition that was there. Okay, because every time a new card is called, it's going to basically say, oh, there's no definition here yet. Okay, then when someone clicks on that second card, they're gonna call this function showDef, which is very similar to what we've already done. We're going to basically now get the element by ID of the definition and kick back, just like we kick back the term. Now instead we're going to use the same random integer, and we're going to kick back the first element, which again isn't the first, it's actually the second element. I know it's confusing. 0 represents the first element, so 1 represents the second element. But since we're using that same random integer, now it's pulling from the same line, but it's pulling the second part of it. So it's giving us the definition. Alright, now let's take a look at the quiz functions. The quiz app is a little trickier, because instead of just giving the definition that corresponds to one random term, we have to also give several wrong answers. Right? So we have to choose a random term, find its associated definition, but then also find 3 other random terms to put along with it. The way we're going to handle this, and forgive me, it's a little confusing to describe verbally, but it has everything to do with this array shuffle. What we're going to do is we're going to basically shuffle the list of these terms and definitions, and what that's going to do is going to randomize our question, but it's going to also randomize the possible answers that we give along with it. Now this array shuffle is another function defined below. I'm not actually going to go through this one. I found this code online that just helped me shuffle an array. You can make sense out of it hopefully if you go through it. But the only thing that matters really is that it's going to shuffle this array, but it's going to keep the terms and the definitions associated with one another. It's not going to mix those up. Okay, now if we want to display the question itself, what we're doing essentially is we're giving the definition of a term, right? So much like before, we're going to push out for this quiz question element. We're going to put the text, which term goes with the following definition, and then beneath it we put the definition 0, 1. Now you might be thinking, well, 0, 1, isn't that always going to be the exact same one? I mean, 0 means it's the first entry in this list, and 1 means it's the second part. So it seems like if we always put this, it should always say a series of events regularly repeated in the same order. But it won't, because what we just did was we shuffled that array, right? So we've randomized the list, and so now the first entry, we don't know what it is. But we'll always pull the first entry because it's going to be a new random question. Now we also want to display the possible answers, right? And to do that, what we're going to do is define the 4 possible answers. Those 4 possible answers have to include the right answer. So you'll see that I'm going to create a new array right here. And that new array includes 4 possible answers. The first answer is the right one. It's the one that goes with the very first definition. Okay, and then I'm going to take just the next 3 consecutive terms, which are going to be random because I've randomly switched around this list of terms. Now, here's the problem. Okay, I've got 4 possible answers, but my correct answer is always the first one. And I don't want to always have the first answer be the correct one, so I need to shuffle this list as well. Well, fortunately, since I already have this array shuffle function, I'm just going to shuffle the array of possible answers. Now, I know the right answer is in here, but I actually, as a developer, I don't know which of these 4 is the right answer. I've just shuffled them up. So I'm going to push these 4 answers out back to answer A, answer B, answer C, and answer D, so they'll display on the screen. But there is a significant issue here, which is I can't, for example, just check and see if the user has gotten the right answer, right? So instead, the way the app works is they click on these 4 answers, and it tells them what the right answer is as a way to sort of check their understanding. So that's what this last part of the function does, show answer. So when someone clicks on that bottom part where the 4 answers are listed, it's going to now kick back, and instead of just filling in all the 4 possible answers, it's going to blank out the 3 other answers and simply say the correct answer is, and then give that one correct answer that I know is right. Okay, I know that probably was a little confusing to listen to, but hopefully you can go back through and check the pieces that didn't make sense to you, and piece this whole thing together to make sense out of it.